Hi folks, you were tasked us today at your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, which is a bit of a departure, I guess, from the normal sort of political considerations, but in this essay, I'd like to talk about the Japanese armed forces in World War II, or specifically the 1941 to 1945 Pacific War. And for younger folks, who may not have covered much history, in 1941, the end of 1941, that the Japanese decided to strike at the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, which had most of the American Pacific Fleet assets there, including battleships, destroyers. The aircraft carriers were out on exercises, so just unbeknownst to the Japanese, so they were saved, which is interestingly was one of the main Japanese targets. But the Japanese launched bombers and fighters from their aircraft carriers off in the Pacific to strike at Pearl Harbor. The background is lengthy and complex, I guess, but the Japanese took the view that they would be the second or even a third-rate power in the world, which was unthinkable from their perspective. Very proud people and a very proud warrior sort of class. If they didn't assert themselves in the region. Now, they decided to invade China. They already had Korea as if you like, a colony from the 1890s. The same with Taiwan, or Formosa as it was called then. That was a Japanese possession, and various other places, Okinawa and various islands around the place. So the Japanese were militarily, quite aggressive, and the West was putting embargoes on them. The United States, Britain, and so on was putting embargoes on the Japanese, embargoes on raw materials such as oil. So the Japanese decided if they were going to make a bid for sort of regional supremacy, really the time was good. Britain and France had been overrun by, or Britain was hard pressed. France had been overrun, as Holland had been, by the Nazis in 1940. So they was kind of out of the picture, and really the only regional power capable of opposing the Japanese was the Americans. America was still struggling with depression, and the Japanese made a risky calculation, but not an ill-advised one given the circumstances of the day. But they decided that what they really wanted was to be left alone in that sort of North Asian, mid and North Asian area, to be the dominant power. And if America would leave them sort of alone to do their own thing there, that was fine. That they were good to go on that. And so, in order to get it to American compliance, they decided to knock out the American naval assets at Pearl Harbor. So the American government, the Japanese figure, would then have the idea, well, gee whiz, this is going to be hard work to stop these Japanese. We're going to have to really, have to get out of bed early and make a big hard work job of it. So why don't we just give them what they want? We'll cut a deal with them. We'll let them have the oil, and they can do what they want in that area of the world. We won't interfere with it, and that's it. So that was the Japanese calculation, that the Americans would just look at it, too hard, too difficult. And there was a lot of goings on in America, communism. There was a lot of goings on in America, communism. There were food riots, the Depression, all that sort of stuff. And I think if you'd been sitting in anyone's shoes in that time, given the world events at the time, you would have figured it was a decent gamble, 60-40, that the Americans would go along with it. But instead, the Americans became enraged, and instead it sort of motivated the whole nation to go to war and to prosecute the war with some vigor. It helped along where I thought, without really, Hitler had agreed to the Japanese, when the Japanese attacked, that Germany, Nazi Germany, would declare war on America and start the submarine campaign against American shipping and so on. So that sort of brought the American government, Franklin Roosevelt's president, the American government said, okay, that's it, mass mobilization. We're putting everything into this, and we're going to defeat these two enemies. Now, the reason that, or part of the reason that the Germans did declare war because they wanted Japanese assistance against the Russians, because the Russians had a few battles with the Japanese along the border there on around the eastern end of the Russian Empire, Vladivostok, and around those sort of around that part of the border where the Japanese were in China, and they wanted the Japanese to launch some attacks along the border to draw off Russian forces. Now, the Russians had stripped most of their troops from there to oppose the Nazi armies in 41. So there weren't many troops there. So the Russians were terrified that the Japanese would actively engage in military operations here. So the Germans were hoping the Japanese would do that, which would then draw away plenty of Russian forces from the area, or alternatively, the Japanese would just occupy vast areas of the Eastern Russian Empire. But either way, the Germans would benefit from this. But the Japanese didn't. They never did that. So the German declaration of war on the United States was ultimately, I thought, counterproductive. Anyway, coming back to the Pacific War. Now, when I was a kid, there were kind of books and comics around. They were sort of tall stories, really, but based on the war in the Pacific, in Asia, and it always portrayed, in this case, English soldiers as huge and muscular with splendid names like Hercules and this sort of thing, and the Japanese were portrayed as they were small, bow-legged. They all had buck teeth for some reason. I don't know why. They had these thick glasses, and they were just effortlessly pushed aside by the British, so that was the sort of depiction of Japanese. Now, when I first started looking at the Pacific War, I was doing some notes, putting some notes together, actually to help someone else who was researching a book, and I was surprised that the Japanese must have been formidable. They couldn't have, recorded that string of victories unless they were pretty good and were well organized and disciplined. So that was sort of my starting point. They had to be reasonably effective, but I didn't realize just how effective they were. And it came, and I've dusted off these notes recently. I came to the view back then, doing that research, that really the Japanese had not been defeated militarily at all. They'd been overwhelmed by industrial might. When I say industrial might, if the Japanese lose a ship, then it takes them, for example, I'm playing with round numbers here, it takes them 18 months to replace that ship. Whereas the Americans lose a ship, they can replace it in 4 months. When the Japanese manufacture one ship, the Americans can manufacture 3 ships, and so on. So they were industrially overwhelmed is the view you come away with. Now, I hadn't realised that that really throughout the war, I don't think the British successfully defeated. British soldiers didn't. So the Japanese beat them pretty much every time. There are a few cases of stalemate where each was able to sort of neutralise the other on have a tie or a draw, or again a stalemate. But I don't think the British ever defeat, other than very minor engagements where the amount of people involved was less than 100 or something. I can't recall off the top of my head any situation where the British defeated the Japanese, militarily and from a naval perspective, that they barely did any better than that. So, and Air Force perspective, same. The Japanese Air Force was. I can't point to a time or think off the top of my head. I'm sure someone can find one instance where the Japanese were not the superior Air Force as well. Now, when it came to doing battle with the Americans, it was, I wouldn't call it the same, but the Japanese had a number of key benefits. They had a very well-trained, disciplined force. Their officer class was very good. Not that they didn't make mistakes, and not that it was perfect all the time. It wasn't. It's warfare, for goodness sakes, and there's a lot of fluid moving sort of parts to it all. There were times when the Japanese made mistakes or miscalculations, they under or over calculated, as indeed did all participants in warfare. But overall, they were very disciplined, well trained. Their soldiers were well trained. They were well led and well organised. Now, the Japanese had a number of benefits. Or advantages. They were experts at ambush warfare. Now, I don't know where they got that ability to get that good in jungle warfare, because there's not many jungles they would have had access to get that level and quality of training, because it was superb. So they were experts at jungle warfare, and particularly ambush, but also jungle reconnaissance. They were particularly impressive in that area. And they were also, I thought, experts at positioning points of, where to place the machine gun nests and how to distribute their military assets to maximum effect. It came across time and time again, whether it be Guadalcanal or anywhere. They were able to do a very good job, I thought, of putting their assets in key position to inflict maximum damage on the enemy and delay the enemy's intentions and objectives, which of course is the part of the thing. So why did the Japanese sort of lose? I mean, ultimately it was again in just being industrially overpowered. When the Japanese lost an aircraft, they couldn't replace it easily, whereas the Americans lost an aircraft, they could replace it easily. The Japanese pilots were very well trained. In the initial stage of the war, the Japanese expertise in pilots was stark between their level of training and competence and expertise and the British and the Americans. The Japanese were very good at. Bear in mind that the British were hard pressed in Europe, so there's that to consider. But the ambush was and the jungle warfare was the reconnaissance was something, and the quality and expertise of the leadership. Now, there were in the aeronautical and or air force and the naval sort of side of things, the Japanese were experts at night warfare, which indeed they were in the jungle as well. So they really honed that to a fine art, and constantly in naval engagements with the Americans, the Japanese were winning pretty much every time, even though they may have had inferior numbers and and less materiel. The American ships may have entered a battle with 1,000 shells to the Japanese had only 150 shells, to shoot out of the big naval guns on the ships, and yet the Japanese would still win. And so naval engagements. But look, when you've got a naval engagement, say the Japanese had 5 ships and the Americans had 9 ships, the Japanese would lose 2 ships, the Americans would lose 2 ships. The Americans would have 2 ships badly damaged, which would have to disengage from the battle, and so on. So the Japanese would satisfied they'd inflict a lot of damage, but the Americans could have those ships replaced in months, and they could have the damaged ships replaced. So the Americans could replace all the damage and all the loss in less than 12 months. The Japanese couldn't. The Japanese would have taken years to replace that amount of losses. So really, if the Americans could afford to lose 20% on every engagement, could afford to lose 20 to 25% more than the Japanese, whether it be in ships and planes and food delivery, supplies, ammunition, could sustain those losses and still come out in front overall. And this was very, very telling. Now, even by late 1943, the Japanese had to make a lot of choices. Do we reinforce this position with more troops and materiel? Do we just provide supplies to the existing troops there, even though we know it's not enough to gain a decisive victory? Or do we move those troops away into somewhere else we've got better access to? So they're having to make decisions because they didn't have the resources to do both. We can't add another 10,000 soldiers to that position and supply them. We don't have the resources to do that. So they were having to make riskier and riskier decisions. For example, in the Guadalcanal campaign, which was a pretty decisive sort of engagement in the overall scheme of things, the Japanese didn't have the resources to adequately or fully reinforce the garrison and to fully supply it. So they had to do trade-offs, and also they couldn't afford the risk of trying to land, to bring ships in close and to use shuttlecraft to offload supplies, because they didn't have the resources to provide the air cover for that. So they would have to dump containers in a harbour with food in the containers, which meant that was then vulnerable to American fighter planes to shoot up the supplies and sink them, or because they're floating in like metal drums, or to shoot them up and sink them, or to spoil them with seawater and the like. So this is a huge issue, because then the Japanese are struggling to resupply their troops in certain areas. But that doesn't mean that the naval engagements around Guadalcanal, the Japanese mostly came out in front. In fact, it was rare that the Americans came out in front. And if the Americans came out in front, it was typically just a fluke. A plane that just happened to spot another group, and they were first, so their aircraft were launched first. And it was those sorts of just lucky strikes rather than skilled military training, or also the Japanese equipment was the Zeros, the Mitsubishi Zero planes were certainly first class aircraft, and the initially at least, and until sort of really late 43, early 44, the Americans couldn't really field machines that were of the same class. And if you've got a good quality plane, then it takes you years to train up the pilots. It's almost no point. So because it's just so hard to complete the training runs and get trained pilots in there. Similarly, if you're investing that much time in training a pilot and you lose them, then it's like you're back to square one, and then the value of the asset is such that it has a reduced value because of the time it takes to train a competent. But having a look at this overall, again, the Japanese beat the British pretty much at every turn, other than a few stalemates. And for most of the engagements, they were beating the Americans. The Americans were winning battles where the Japanese soldiers had been denied food, and so they were so emaciated and gangrenous and so on that they were could be beaten. And really just better supply, better resources, or more resources. So they were able to overwhelm the Japanese. Even in the end, though, the cost of the casualty cost of invading Japan, or even isolating completely, was such that the atomic bomb was seen as a desirable thing. Now, before I did that research, I hadn't been aware of that, just how good the Japanese military had been and how effective they were by First World Army standards. They were very good. And so this is something that probably surprises a lot of people. The Japanese skills, jungle warfare, reconnaissance in the air, and again, night naval engagements in particular, they were very, very good. You've been fantastic today, your Pushback Challenge. Thank you for listening.